Hey nerds, Farmer Jesse here. Welcome to Growers Daily, your daily dose of ecological farming insight. It is Thursday, November 7th, 2024, and today we are going to discuss turning forested land into farmland, growing herbs, and when food became important. I mean, for me. So let's do it. So as I am continuing to think about and plot out our tree plantings, one thing I realized that I haven't talked about here yet, though I did discuss it a bit in the Living Soil Handbook, is starting a garden where there is currently a young forest. I get questions about that a lot, which makes sense because if you're looking for land, it's easy to see that the most affordable land is often new growth forests. A quick story about this from our own experience. Our mentor sold us a plot of like 7 acres of land many years ago. That was almost entirely woods, but had some flat spots and had a lot of potential. However, it was also covered up almost entirely with cedar trees and poplars, which in the tree world are pretty fast growing recovery species that make way for like your bigger, harder wooded trees like oaks and maples and hickory, etc. But if we wanted to garden that area, we had to clear them. We had to clear that young forest. So at first, because I was young and naive and didn't really have an absolute need for that land right away, we were at the time sharing garden space with our neighbors. I started clearing it by hand. The thing is, this is brutally difficult work. I didn't have a YouTube channel then, but it would have been hilarious and sad. I remember reading about or hearing about Elliot Coleman, how he cleared a bunch of trees by hand when he first started his farm. And I was like, I can do that. And technically I could, and certainly did for a while, cutting a group of trees down, sawing them up to get them out of the forest as much as possible and use that for firewood. Then I would burn like the rest in giant piles of wildly hot cedar. Then I would dig up the stump and then do it all over again. But this was very slow, and I'm definitely glad that at some point I was like, yeah, let's just hire this job out. Then in 4 hours, nearly an acre of the new growth forest was completely clear. Another hour later, our neighbor had plowed it up. Then the next day we had, 50 or so beds made and ready to cover crop for the winter. My back was very thankful for that. The lesson I think I took from that experience is the same lesson that a lot of permaculturalists take, which is that while we have the equipment and affordable enough oil to do all this land work, let's get areas set up for long-term food production because doing it by hand is just brutal. Now, some of the things you'd want to consider if you were going to clear a forest this way is, well, obviously don't do this to a beautiful old growth forest if you can help it. There's a ton of habitat in an established forest, a lot of native plants, and a lot of value to the trees that are already established there, to both the soil, water, and local ecology. We have a lot of forests that were effectively clear cut here in Kentucky and then left to grow fallow, or old pastures allowed to go fallow that are largely just cedar trees. And I see no real harm now in reclaiming some of those areas for ecological production. In terms of the actual process, you'd want to do it in a drier time of year for sure. You want to plan to get it back into growing plants as quickly as possible as well, if not just mulched entirely to keep the soil in place. In the case of heavy rainfall or wind, you will lose some topsoil and gain some heavy compaction in the process of bulldozing. So expect at least a year of healing to take place, if not more. The soil may release a lot of nitrogen that first season though, so it's possible you will see some significant plant growth in the first year as well. Wherever all the stumps and trees are piled can be a future burn pile or several future burn piles, then the resulting ash and soil mixture can potentially be used back on the gardens by mixing it with compost. But just do so carefully, as although ash can provide calcium and potassium to soil, it can also raise the pH of soil, which may be a good thing in acidic soils, but not in alkaline situations. There are also mulching machines that can literally mulch a forest, but I don't necessarily recommend that approach. To be clear, I have not tried it specifically, but I have seen what it looks like afterward, after one of those machines goes through a small forest. And I can imagine the resulting thick strips of wood from that forest mulcher would be a massive hassle to deal with for a long time if you're trying to build gardens. Plus, I've seen where they leach heavily into the soil, which could throw off the pH quite intensively for a while. Another thing we dealt with in that experience was some large residual roots we had to dig up, like kind of out of the garden beds. And we ran into a lot of them when we were making the beds with the rotary plow and the BCS, and it would literally, when you'd hit a stump or when you'd hit one of those roots, it would swing that BCS right into your stomach. So that was a lot of fun. We had lots of fun bruises. But because the eastern cedars we were dealing with don't really sucker out, like meaning they don't sprout from their roots really, there wasn't a battle against more trees popping up like throughout the course of the garden's life. There was some germination of tree saplings, but nothing terrible. If it had been all sycamores or something similar to that, I imagine our first year would have been a lot more intense fighting suckers and roots. Wood sorrel was our biggest weed, and we had a chef who bought it by the pound every week. So that one actually kind of worked out in our favor. Anyway, I'm curious what you all have learned from clearing a forest, or if you're looking at a forest to possibly clear it. Any big lessons or takeaways from that experience? Shade may be one. Make sure you are considering how much sunlight you want and how much you don't want to restrict. And we didn't clear all the forest. We had cedar surrounding us. So that made it tough because those cedars are shady year round. Great for wind blocks, but cast a lot of shade, especially when they got bigger. So that's one of those things that has to be planned for in the clearing process. Some shade you may want, and some trees you may want to keep. But you may want to think about where that sunlight is coming from and how it's going to affect your springs and your falls. Now, again, I just want to be clear that I'm not suggesting everyone run out and plow up a forest, not in the least. But I know that a lot of times the most affordable farmland is currently in meh trees like the young cedar forest we were dealing with. And small portions could be taken out and turned into productive gardens or silvopastures or whatever. For me, it doesn't have to be trees or food. I think trees and food is a great option. And one, as ecological farmers, we are well suited to manage. Anyway, look forward to hearing your thoughts on farming a forest. In the next segment, we're going to talk herbs. BRB. Today's episode of Growers Daily is brought to you by Johnny's Selected Seeds. When you need proven varieties you can count on and detailed guidance from seeding to harvest, consider Johnny's your trusted growing partner. Their same-day shipping can help keep your planting schedules on track when the unexpected happens. They're here to help you grow good food. Turning to Johnny's means you can plant high-quality, trial-proven varieties with confidence and know that their expert staff is ready to help with first-hand knowledge, because they've grown them themselves. Learn more at johnnyseeds.com. All right, back to the show. If you, the listener, are enjoying this podcast and want to support it, you can at patreon.com/no-till-growers. Maybe the show has become a regular part of your daily life, and you would like to keep it that way. If so, rad, but also please consider signing up for $2 or $5 a month or whatever you can afford to keep it going and growing. I will try to get to questions from everywhere, but I will always get to those Patreon questions. Today's question comes from Patreon member Pat Davis, who writes, I'm trying to grow a medicinal herb garden in Zone 9, Florida. I started one last spring to meet the needs of a large extended family. I have made so many mistakes in my planning. These herbs are mostly perennial or self-seeding. Some grow big, some crawl along the ground, some need dry soil, some need wet, some need direct sun. So hard to meet all of their needs. I would love to know how the big boys do it. Do they plant lots of varieties or just a handful? Do they plant in raised beds or a garden, etc.? How do they irrigate? Not much info out there on the actual planting, and maintenance. Great question, Pat, and thanks for your support. So in the name of full disclosure, I am not a big boy herb grower, but we have grown quite a few herbs over the years, and I'll offer what insight I have there and also give you a few follow-up resources that I think might be helpful. First, my assumption here is that you are not just talking about basic culinary herbs like basil, cilantro, dill, and parsley. Those all grow similarly to vegetables and should grow fine in Florida, at least at certain times of the year. Dill and cilantro would be the trickier ones, I imagine, because they are somewhat ironically, given their typical food pairings with cucumbers and tomatoes, respectively, they don't love the heat. But over the winter, you should be able to grow oodles of them, a word I honestly don't think has ever left my mouth. Shade cloth will also come in handy for the crops like that. For the basil, I would likely want that in a greenhouse or high tunnel for all the rain you all get down there. It rather likes the dry heat, so we usually grow ours in a tunnel with drip irrigation, so the leaves stay as dry as possible. Now again, I'm assuming here you know all this and have the basic culinary herbs under control. The slower perennial and medicinal herbs are the more finicky ones that often require exactly what they require. There's no easy way around that. With the annual ones, you can fudge it for a year and give them mostly what they need to make it. The slower growing stuff with deeper taproots, those can be challenging because the amount of time they're in the ground, the amount of shade, that they may require, and their nutritional and water needs are very individualized in the same way that they are for many fruit trees. Most of the big growers that I know of focus on just a handful of herbs that make the most sense for them in their context and really try to maximize that effort. Like maybe ginseng is a little too tough to grow where you are that far south, but something like ginger could thrive. Or we struggle to grow rosemary year round here, but lavender does fine in Kentucky, whereas rosemary would probably do great for you where it doesn't get as cold. If it were me, I would pick up a copy of The Organic Medicinal Herb Farmer, a book from Chelsea Green, which I haven't read in a really long time, but I remember having a lot of great detail. Also find some local herb growers at the market potentially and talk to them about what has and hasn't worked. You mentioned, asking about the raised beds, and if you are growing in raised beds, that might be one way to really dial in the conditions for a specific crop. Or if not currently, you could consider building some of those raised beds for the more finicky herbs you desire. That way you could put your irrigation on timers and really control the conditions and grow great herbs in one little area. And just Googling around, I can see several herb nurseries in Florida that may be worth chatting with. They can likely provide the best plants for the region and the best tips for how to manage them. Like even an herb professional up in Maine will only be so helpful for you down there in Florida. So it's good to just talk to the nerds, find the nerds, seek them out, especially the ones that live in your area. I am all about exploring herbs more in depth on this show. So thanks for the question, Pat, and I hope the answer was somewhat helpful, but I also promise to keep exploring herbs because I love herbs. I used to say that I've reached that age where I need fresh herbs on everything. Like that's how old I am, fresh herbs on everything, years old. And so yeah, I plan to explore it a lot more. I think the biggest thing is just keep in mind that if you know the exact herbs you want to grow, it is possible to just gear your production in a small area around each of those herbs and needs. It's the fundamental thing that makes farming tough. We are trying to grow crops from all over the world, bred in significantly different conditions in a single climate that probably looks nothing like where it originated. Because that's a smart business that we've decided to embed ourselves in. The weird thing is, though, oftentimes we can do it. That's what's incredible about plants. They can adapt. With that, we will take a quick break, and when we return, we will discuss the origins of food in general. For me. Be right back. Today's episode of Growers Daily is brought to you by Farmhand. I don't know about you, but I got into farming to be in the field growing food for my community, not creating elaborate pack lists, not writing newsletters or responding to emails, not designing and maintaining web stores, and etc. And I especially don't enjoy doing those things after an already full and fulfilling day of growing food. Actually, if I spent less time on my phone and behind the computer, that would be great. If only there were a solution for that. Enter Farmhand. Farmhand is the only all-in-one virtual assistant built by and for farmers. With one single platform, Farmhand enables you to offload your administrative tasks, send and manage communications, and sell more to your customers. Farmhand saves growers an average of 6 hours of administrative load each week. That's 6 hours so you can get back into the field, spend more time with friends or family, or have a life outside of the farm, which is actually a thing. Think about it. What would you do with an extra 6 hours a week? Sign up for a free trial with the link in the show notes because now is the best time to dial in those systems for the next growing season. Follow the Farmhand link in the show notes to learn more. All right, back to the show. So we have a pretty large platform at this point, but behind every single one of those people who followed or subscribed or has determined they want to follow or our work in some way is a story of how they came to be interested enough in food to want to do the hard work of growing it, or are curious where it came from, or are at least interested enough to watch or hear someone else talk about growing it. I think certainly people of my generation and upbringing, we all have a genesis story when it comes to food, our food awakening, so to speak. The moment when we went from maybe enjoying food to wondering where in the heck it comes from. For me, it started when I was living in New York City and working in wine. Remember, I did not grow up on a farm. I came to this backward. Now, I had already worked in high-end kitchens and as a cook for many years at this point and appreciated good ingredients, but I didn't necessarily start caring about where the food came from entirely, or how it was grown, or how that affected my own health or the health of the environment or communities where the food was produced until I was like solidly in my mid-20s. None of that had ever really crossed my mind. But with wine, where it comes from and how it was grown, even down to the soil type, is a huge part of every wine story. So in the wine trade, you were pretty well forced to learn about the agricultural practices of the producer. You start to connect good organic practices with wines you like or the wines you didn't like. At the time, which would have been in the mid-aughts in New York City, quote unquote, natural wines were a very new thing, commercially speaking. This term is almost ubiquitous now, it feels like, but at the time, there were not a ton of us who actually liked or drank natural wines. These were wild, textural beverages that the average wine consumer would often be like, this glass sort of tastes like sausage. Do you have something like, I don't know, more normal? But I loved those natural wines. They tasted alive and often somewhat effervescent. And at the same time that I started to go down that rabbit hole and meet those producers and visit those farms and learn more about their organic and often biodynamic practices within the vineyards, a friend handed me a book, The Omnivore's Dilemma by Michael Pollan. And that book had me suddenly very curious about food production. To be clear, I don't necessarily recommend that book now. It's perhaps a little bit outdated, but at the time, living in New York City, everyone was talking about it. It felt innovative and inspiring and well-timed. It just hit at the right moment. Fervor and interest in local food was growing. Chefs like Dan Barber and Sean Brock were exploring seasonality and working closely with farmers. Documentaries like An Inconvenient Truth and later Food Inc. had people concerned about the environment and where the food was coming from. But that book, The Omnivore's Dilemma, was for me and for many the catalyst that brought all of those feelings together. I can't tell you how many times that book has come up in conversations I've had with people about how they got into farming. Like when people ask where that farm to table movement started, that book is kind of the one that tied it all together for me. Indeed, talk to a lot of folks in this business who are also in their 30 teens like myself, and they will likely say that The Omnivore's Dilemma was a huge part of the farm genesis story. What I guess I'm curious about, and the reason I wanted to share that story, is what is the resource now? Maybe I'm opening up a can of worms here, but I also think that it's interesting and important to hear what are the resources that are inspiring people to want to farm and learn more about where their food is coming from now. Is the next Back to the Land movement going to be, or currently being, sparked on TikTok, a podcast? Maybe it's a book, but I have to assume it has to be something else at this point. Not as much reading as there used to be. Is it a Netflix show? So I guess you all tell me, those of you who just got interested in food in the last 5 years or so and started following this channel or others, what started it? Maybe it was just COVID and food insecurity, but also maybe there were other things at this time pointing you in that direction. Or maybe not. You tell me. Maybe it was completely random. Maybe yesterday you were like, I'm going to look up lizards. And then today you were like, I'm going to look up food production. I don't know. But I would be curious to find out. So otherwise, I think I'm going to leave it there. We will do the Feedback Friday thing tomorrow, where maybe we can examine some of those responses. Huge shouts to Willie Breeding for the theme music and to the crew at No-Till Growers for their support. Thank you to everyone who has been listening and engaging and subscribing and following for whatever reason that you have. And absolutely, especially to those who have signed up to be a Patreon member at patreon.com/No-Till Growers, where at a certain level, or if you just bump up from one level to another, or if you just sign up in the month of November, which is easy enough, you get a shout out on the show. So big shout outs today to Carly. Carly's a good name. Sam Jones. Sam Jones, a classic name. DeGlooster Hardunkenshud. Oh, DeGlooster Hardunkenshud. Wait a second. Is that a Key and Peele reference? DeGlooster Hardunkenshud. You are on the West. You played for the West in a Key and Peele skit. Good stuff. And Michael, but because I can't break copyright rules, I can't. Maybe this one's fan fiction. So DeGlooster Hardunkenshud was a football player, and he teammate Sam Jones on his team, and Michael was also on his team. They started they actually play in the XFL now, and they've got a really good thing going with their team. They're about to win the championship. Carly is their coach. Carly is a really, really good defensive coach. Lacks a little bit on the offensive end, but makes up but believes wholeheartedly, as they should, that defense wins championships, which is the name of this book, this little work of fan fiction. So anyway, thanks to whoever supports us in whatever way you can. We will see you tomorrow on Friday. Thanks for listening. Bye.